rolling, I think. It's a real delight to welcome Shigeru Miyagawa. Shigeru has been at MIT since 1991 as Professor of Linguistics and has held the Kochi Manjiro Chair for Japanese Language and Culture. And for the past 20 years, you've also been doing a lot in online education. Actually, I was looking you up beforehand and I was thinking, gosh, I'm really looking forward to talking with you about the incredible open learning programs that you appear to have been developing. In 2022, you were awarded a very prestigious São Paulo Excellence Chair by the São Paulo Research Foundation, and you've been carrying out research there as a visiting professor of biosciences, along with your MIT work. And I guess the thing we're here for is the work that you've been doing in linguistics and working with songbirds in nature. So I'm really excited to be hearing this talk. I have a great interest in the structure of language and the way that it influences our thinking, and particularly the way that it can influence our potential, or it is an inherently cooperative act. And so hopefully we'll get some chances to explore some of the implications for cooperation and processuality in this conversation. Wonderful, thank you. I will hand over to you. Please take it away, Shigeru.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you to ProSocial organization for inviting me to give this talk. It's very nice to see so many of you. What I would like to suggest is that instead of me just talking at you for 45 minutes, I'll be very happy for you to ask questions, make suggestions as we go along, so that this is more of a conversation than a lecture. Paul kindly mentioned the online education piece of my career. One of the things that we learned in online education is that one-way lectures are not very effective for teaching students. That it's much better to have interactive conversations with students. Let the students, in fact, work out the solutions to the problems. They tend to stick. Whereas one-way lectures sound good when you're giving it, but it doesn't stick too much. So I really would like to encourage you to do that. And I wonder if, Paul, I'm not very good at tracking raised hands. If I could ask, if I could ask you to track that, and feel free to interrupt.
Yeah, I'll do that. And also, if anybody has a question in the chat line as well, I'll pass that along, shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm feeling slightly offended just at the moment because Zoom just asked me to confirm if I'm speaking English. I think I'm speaking Australian.
Okay, well, Zoom is paying attention then. I gave a similar talk a couple of weeks ago at the Central Square Theater here in Cambridge. It's between Harvard and MIT. It was a wonderful audience, and I had planned this big talk, but I got to maybe 20% because there was so much conversation, and I had a wonderful time. I learned a lot, and so I would encourage you to say whatever comes to mind. It's a pretty broad and developing field. Okay, so let me go ahead and begin, and I'll be looking for your hands as I go along. So the topic today is about AI, artificial intelligence, and we are living in a very exciting time. I mean, AI is sort of all of the rage. You cannot open a newspaper or any website without seeing something new about AI every day. It's sort of the next big thing. What I want to do today is to step back and look at artificial intelligence from the context of human intelligence and how that has developed within human evolution, and put that against artificial intelligence and see where we are. Okay? A lot of human intelligence that we think of is based on language. Okay? Certainly, it's not just language. We have non-linguistic intelligence and creativity like music and visual arts. But because I'm a linguist and I know something about language, I'm going to focus on that and to look at language and how it developed in human evolution as a modern human behavior, track it through time, and end up hopefully at a place where we can compare how human language developed against these large language models, which are used in generative AI today, and see what that comparison looks like. Okay? As you'll see, it's actually quite different what we see today with large language models from how we developed as human. So that's something worth really thinking about. Okay? So that's sort of the agenda. So let me share a screen so that I can show you some things that I have been working on. Okay, so the title I gave it is Quest for Fire in ChatGPT, AI from the Perspective of Human Evolution. Fire is going to be a very, very important topic, as you'll see. Okay. So just to go back in time, Charles Darwin has this very famous quote that says, "The difference between the mind of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense." And so we made this huge jump as Homo sapiens from our primate ancestors. And Darwin was sort of puzzled by it, because as you know, his theory of selection predicts small sequence of changes and not this huge cognitive leap that we took. Okay? And a lot of this has to do with language. And so he really wasn't sure why we made this huge cognitive leap, but we did. And to this day, we still are not sure why Homo sapiens made this leap. So in terms of language, as when I started to work on this about 12 years ago, I kept asking people, when did human language appear in evolution? And the general timeline I heard was 100,000 years ago. And I asked, how do you get that? How do you get 100,000 years ago? And the anthropologist who told me this showed me this piece. This is a very famous piece. It's a piece of ochre. It's very small. It's a couple of inches long. That was discovered in the Blombos Cave in South Africa, right at the tip of South Africa. They discovered thousands of pieces of these ochre pieces. And as you can see, it has these engravings, very symbolic, very regular engravings. And these engravings gave the anthropologist the idea that whoever made this, the Homo sapiens, must have had language, because this looks like the regular patterns that you find in language. Okay? I actually wondered whether this is a good piece of evidence for that. Okay? It was dated back to 73,000 years ago. So according to the anthropologists, language must have existed at least 100,000 years ago. That gave rise to the kind of behavior that made it possible to create this kind of regular engraving. Okay? This is what you'll see people show you when they talk about the emergence of language. Okay. But I wanted something a little bit more concrete. And so something that I have been working on with colleagues in São Paulo and also the American Museum of Natural History in New York is to see if we can use genetics to pinpoint when human language was in the early Homo sapien population. So when did human language emerge, the lower boundary? The idea is very simple. And it was originally thought of by René Huybrecht of Utrecht University. Again, the idea is very simple. We know that Homo sapiens appeared in Africa about 230,000 years ago, 230,000 years ago. And so presumably there was one group of Homo sapiens which then split and kept splitting. Okay? Every one of those branches has language. And so the hypothesis is that before the first split here in red circle, there must have been some seed of linguistic capacity, which then seeded all the branches of our Homo sapien population. So if we can identify the time when the first split occurred, then we can say, I think with certainty, that linguistic capacity existed before this first split. Okay, that's the logic. Okay, and so once the split occurred, it kept splitting until today. We have like 7,000 languages in the world. That's how many that are attested. Probably more, but that's the sort of official number we get from the United Nations. But what we want to know is, when was that first split? Because the linguistic capacity must have existed before that. Okay? We know that the first split was with the Khoisan group in Southern Africa, right here. And there is good genetic evidence. So they still live in Africa, in southwestern tip of Africa, the Khoisan group. The Khoisan group has the most diverse genetic composition because they are the first sort of Homo sapiens that gave rise to all of the Homo sapiens that we see today. And the work that we've been doing based on Huybrecht's work is to look at the whole bunch of genetics work of early Homo sapiens to see when that first split was. And we have been able to pinpoint to about 135,000 years ago, based on whole genome single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP. This is the latest, the most recent technology for genetic analysis. So 135,000 years ago, give or take 20,000 years. Here are some of the studies that we've looked at. We looked at a whole bunch of them and came up with the idea, the working hypothesis, that language existed at least 135,000 years ago, what we call the lower boundary. Yeah. This is not when language emerged. Okay? We don't know when language emerged. Okay? Somewhere earlier. We don't know what the upper boundary is for human language, but it was there 135,000 years ago, according to the genetic studies that we analyzed. Okay, so now I think for the first time we have something really concrete to say about human language, that based on genetics, it existed in our early ancestors 135,000 years ago. Okay, because otherwise we really don't have anything concrete to go on. Archaeological record doesn't give us any concrete evidence for when language existed in Homo sapiens. So here is a very concrete empirical piece of evidence for when language existed. We have independent sort of verification of this. There was an article published in Nature in 2023 that basically gave the same thing, that sequenced the whole genomes of 44 Khoisan subjects, show that they split about 120 to 135,000 years ago. So that's a very nice affirmation of what we learned. Okay? And it turns out that this 135,000 years ago has an important role to play in trying to figure out how human intelligence developed in Homo sapiens. So let me turn to that. So development of modern human behavior. Modern human behavior is what archaeologists, anthropologists use for the kind of behavior that we think of as humans today, language being the primary modern human behavior, but also music, art, religion, and so forth, okay, which appeared sometime around the time of language. What we didn't know until our study, and by the way, our study is still ongoing. It's in preparation. We are about to submit to a journal. But what's interesting is that, until our study, we were not sure what the role of human language was in the development of human intelligence and creativity. But now we think we have something interesting to say. So we identified 135,000 years ago as when language had to have been in the Homo sapien population. Independently, there's a bunch of studies that show that modern human behavior, like body decorations and burying of the dead and so forth, which are very symbolic behavior, were there before 135,000 years ago, but about 100,000 years ago, it appeared as a standard species-wide behavior. Okay? Things like body decorations, the symbolic behavior. From this, we surmise that it was really language that triggered all of this modern human behavior. It's not that language was part and parcel of modern human behavior, but language came first, and language is sort of symbolic behavior par excellence. And that developed our behavior, our intelligence, our brain, such that we were able to then behave in a way where we were able to have all of these symbolic things, body decoration. These are all discovered in Africa, in Southern Africa, the Blombos Cave, and the burial of the dead, which did happen before. In fact, Neanderthals may have buried their dead in spots, but it became a regular behavior about 100,000 years ago. So there's this interesting gap of 135,000 years ago when language had to be there, and then 100,000 years ago when modern human behavior appeared as a standard behavior across the species. Okay. I want to now take you on a journey of one kind of modern human behavior, stone tool making. This is really interesting, and it is something that you can actually study. Keep in mind, we're looking at 100,000 years ago as when something happened in our brain, and we think because of language that triggered the way that we think and behave as Homo sapiens, as human beings. The very first tool, stone tool, that has been discovered is a Lomequian tool It was dated back to 3.3 million years ago, discovered in Kenya. Okay? 3.3 million years ago. Now, I'd like for you to pay attention to the time scale here. There's something very, very intriguing about the time scale, something that my colleague Ian Tattersall of American History of Natural Science and others have talked about. So Lomekwian 3.3 million years ago, it's a very rough tool with just the one side napped, has a blade that can be used to, cut high, crush nuts and roots and so forth. The next innovation, the older one, okay, occurred about 1 million years later. The older one was a smaller tool. It's very similar to the Lomekwian, just the one side that's been napped. And this was actually a very good tool. Australopithecus developed it, and Homo erectus took it all over, out of Africa, into Middle East, into Asia, and so forth, and Europe. You find it all over. Okay, so that's the older one. And then about 700,000 years later, this new tool shows up, the Acheulean. The Acheulean is like the older one in that you have a side that's napped, but unlike the older one, now you have two sides that's napped. It has symmetry. Okay? Again, about 700,000 years. Until Acheulean showed up, the older one, the earlier tool, pretty much stayed as it was. And it was carried all over Middle East, Asia, and Europe by Homo erectus. And Acheulean. And then the next innovation, which happened 1 million years later, is the Acheulean tool developed in Africa, like everything else. It started in Africa. It developed, but stopped at the Mobius line from India all the way up to Northern Europe. Above the Mobius line, you just had the older one tool, but below the Mobius line, you had two tools, the older one tool and the Acheulean. So you had two styles of tools under the Mobius line. And then 1 million years later, the late Acheulean shows up, and this late Acheulean was a very beautiful tool. You can see it's thinner. So the left is the early Acheulean, right is late Acheulean. It's thinner. Okay, this is something that you see throughout the development of tools. As you develop, it becomes thinner, lighter, and smaller. But the late Acheulean had another property that we did not see in the earlier tools. It had sort of artistic value to it. On the left, you see this very beautiful late Acheulean, which has a shell in the middle. So the toolmaker who made this chose a piece of rock that happened to have a shell in the middle and carved the two sides around it to make this beautiful piece. The shell had absolutely no utilitarian purpose, none. Okay? But it looks like it had some aesthetic value, which we're seeing for the first time. On the right, again, late Acheulean, the stonemaker who made this chose a piece of rock that's quite beautiful, very colorful. Again, the color has no utilitarian purpose, but the toolmaker wanted to have his tool look beautiful. Okay? So for the first time that we know, we have aesthetics come into the behavior of Homo sapiens. Okay, so this is Acheulean, late Acheulean. And then 300,000 years later, we get this amazing innovation called the Mousterian tool. Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals developed this. What they did was to take a base, a rock, and then carved small pieces out of it. Okay? It's not like they're carving a side to make it into a a blade like earlier, they took a piece of rock and carved out small pieces so that they were able to make these very lightweight, sharp tools from which they made, for example, spearheads. Okay. Okay. But notice if you track the timetable, Lomekwian 3.3 million years ago, and then a million years later, older one, and then 700,000 years later, earlier, and then a million years later, late Acheulean. So you have these long stretches of time during which pretty much no innovation occurred. They're busy spreading the tool, but there was no innovation for a million years until the next. And then something happened about 100,000 years ago. All of a sudden, you had this explosion of tool styles all over Africa. Numerous styles that happened in Africa, and the innovations came one after another. Instead of a million years or 700,000 years, you had just thousands of years between innovations. And this is looking more like today. Right? Today, we're used to thinking of innovation happening very, very quickly. iPhone that shows up every year. But that was not the case with early Homo sapiens. Early Homo sapiens were perfectly happy having the older one tool for a million years without changing it very much. But it's only when something happened in our brain, something that a lot of people call symbolic behavior, in which, as my colleague Ian Taroso said, we started to process information in a radically different way about 100,000 years ago, such that we began to process information much more quickly, and we began to be able to imagine things and worlds that didn't exist very quickly, such that we can innovate very quickly. And that's what innovation is, right? We imagine something that doesn't exist, and then we try to create it. So this jives nicely with what we discovered based on genetics. The human language had to have been there at the latest by 135,000 years ago. And then there was this gap of about 30,000 years before this kind of modern human behavior, like body decorations, sophisticated weaponry, and visual arts appeared. And so we think that it's language that really triggered this kind of way of processing information in a way that we became very symbolic in the way we behave. And that idea of symbolic is very important when we look at large language models. Are we doing okay? Any questions up to now?
No question. Well, Tom has a topic that he'd like to talk about, but I thought maybe, Tom, it's around progressive development of symbolic language and vocalization in other species, in primates, proto-languages in primates and other species. But Tom, are you okay would you like to pick that up now, or should we?
It's whenever. It felt like when you say language, it's either written or spoken, kind of, is usually the way we think about it. And it's obviously not written. That's thousands of years later. But the spoken language, already there's lots of communication in animals, and new scientists are beginning to see more kinds of proto-language happening, different kinds of communication obviously has meaning being transferred. So there's a way in which the language showing up is being done by this symbolism, the evolution of symbolism. And this development is very interesting development. I'm absolutely fascinated with it. But I think there's a parallel channel which is probably happening, which maybe there's no way to find out, no way to tap that. The vocalization, the sound dimension of language to what extent is it branching off from whatever, at least primates, if not other mammals and birds and whatever, that the people there are sensing we could do different things with this, and they're making slight variations in the sounds that they're making, and it's beginning to be understood as that variation of sound means this other variation, like a danger is not just from a tiger, it's from an elephant or something like that, depending on how the vocalization happens. I'm just curious about the parallel development of vocalization as well as the things we're being taught now.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you for that point. A very important point. Linguists take for granted when we say language, we assume that everyone knows what we are talking about, but obviously we have a very specialized definition of language. One thing that going back to Darwin, which I quoted, a contemporary of Darwin's, Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently discovered evolution by selection, says something very interesting. He said, he looked at language, human language, and said he couldn't see any problem solved by language that could not be solved without it. And what he was referring to is, Tom, what you're saying, early Homo sapiens before language, as we define language, were doing just fine. We're communicating just fine. Homo erectus lived for 1.5 million years. They were doing just fine. They're living a rich life. They're feeding themselves. They're having a perfectly good life without language. And so Alfred Russel was completely mystified as to why language arose, because he just couldn't see any use for it. And to this day, we're not quite sure what human language is for. That may be surprising to people who haven't really looked at language. You say, oh, we use it for communication. But first of all, we're communicating just fine before language. Okay. And so, why did language appear? And human language is unique among the different communication systems. So just to give you one really simple lesson in human language that makes it unique from birdsong and primate alarm calls. So human language, all 7,000, human language has at least two parts. One, we have words, okay, distinct words. And a high school graduate knows about 60,000 words, and table and pen and computer. But we don't just speak in words, right? Words are put together as expression. There's a word order. And that expression is created by grammar, which is different from words. So there are two layers to human language: words and grammar, or what we call syntax. Okay? And the two, it's hard to imagine them separate. It's like, the inner and outer layers of a globe. But when you study human language, you can see that there are two parts to it. Languages have different syntax, and of course we have different words. There's no other communication system that I know of that has these two layers. Birdsong, for example, can be very complex. Nightingale song can be extremely complex. They can sing up to like 200 versions of their songs, but it's always one note after another in some algorithmic variation. Same with alarm calls. It's like leopard, eagle, snake. Okay? These are sort of one-dimensional communication systems. We have a multi-dimensional system, and it's a real mystery as to how that occurred. And so human language is unique in that way, and it popped up sometime before 135,000 years ago. We don't know why. As far as we can tell, there was no reason for it to come up in evolution. So And in terms of vocalization, that's something that I'm not really as familiar with. There are colleagues I work with who are much more familiar with this. But obviously, our vocal system has to have been ready, just like our brain, for language. And there are things that happen in our vocal system that made it possible. Okay? So the vocal cord kind of lowered to make it possible for us to speak, but then we had to sacrifice. We cannot drink and speak at the same time or breathe at the same time. And there are primates that can. We sacrifice that in order for us to be able to speak. Okay? So many, many interesting things. We're finding that fish actually make sounds, these kind of explosive sounds to communicate underwater, right? This is a fairly recent discovery from what I understand. On my São Paulo team, I have two very distinguished scholars who are studying frogs. There are lots of frogs in Brazil. And it's just fascinating. It's fascinating to learn about how they communicate. They communicate through sound, but also they change their body color to try to attract mate. So, yeah, thank you for the question. Any other question or comments?
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. There's a comment from Suzanne. Would you like to raise that, or are you happy just to leave that as a comment? And a question from Jessica.
You might need to unmute.
Hi. Thank you for coming and giving this lecture. I don't study language, but I was wondering if you happen to know about the areas of the brain that Homo sapiens was using around that turning point of 100,000 years ago, and if there's a difference now of like where people are really doing, like how prefrontal, like kind of like how far back is it their language working in their brain versus like now, how far forward into prefrontal cortex are we? I don't know where language is based in the brain then or now.
Yeah, just where you're pointing, Jessica. So there are two regions of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, right above your left ear. For 90% of the population, it's lateralized to the left hemisphere. The Broca's area is for production. Wernicke's area is for reception. Interestingly, it's 90% of the population, but 10% of the population has lateralization on the right side of the brain.
Weird.
Yeah. The Broca's area and Wernicke's area you find also in monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very old. It's just that monkeys don't have the kind of capacity for generating syntax and grammar, which is Broca's area, that we are able to have. In fact, I'm now running some brain imaging experiments with colleagues who know this much better than me, comparing human brain to primate brain, and see if we can really identify what the differences are and what the similarities are between human and non-human primates.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so just so I understand, it's the same part of the Homo sapiens, you know, all this time, they've been using the same area, it's in here, and that hasn't really changed. And I guess, yeah, I've just been like wondering if what happened as part of that the evolutionary like leap forward was something about, you know, brain development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We would all love to know the answer to that. Yeah, yeah. You know, this is a brand new field. I mean, you know, it's brand new field. And so if anyone, you know, young or not so young people are interested in this, we're going to have some major breakthroughs in the next 5 years. major breakthroughs, especially based on neuroscience and also on genetics.
Yeah.
Both are really developing very, very, very fast.
Yeah, I just one last comment. I'm extremely excited about how we're learning how AI learns, and I'm hopeful that we can take that learning and turn it towards trauma recovery and kind of like reverse engineer to find more efficient methods of doing trauma recovery for everybody. So
that would be really, AI is going to be really exciting in many, many fields. No doubt about it. One exciting project I'm doing, Tian, who is in the audience, we are now looking at a language that has been dead for a long, long time. When we're using ChatGPT to revive it.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's Kian is the key person for this. Okay, these are wonderful questions. I'll be happy to take one more before I move on.
Okay, I guess I have a quick question. I think it's really quick. I think you're setting up your argument around the idea of this common ancestor of language. Is there any possibility that a language could have developed independently in different branches, or post that break, or is
that's
that
always possible? That's always possible, Paul. But if that happened, it would not be surprising to find a particular branch of Homo sapiens that, for example, doesn't have language, or has some system that's just fundamentally different from language. But that's not the case. All 7,000 languages that are spoken or signed, 150 of them are sign languages. All 7,000 languages have pretty much the same property. You got words, you got syntax, you have phonology, you have semantics, you have pragmatics. And so it would be very surprising if all of these 7,000 languages somehow started developing after we started to branch out.
Thank you very much. Well, I think maybe we'll get on to the rest of your argument. And if just for the audience, if you really want to ask a question, I think the best way is to raise your hand, because it's a little hard for me to tell whether the comments in the chat are just commentary or whether you'd particularly like to ask the question at this point in time. You're welcome to, but otherwise I'll let Professor Miyagawa manage the time so that you can get to everything you want to.
Okay, well, we're actually moving well. We're like developing in evolution quicker and quicker. All right, so this amazing development that you see 100,000 years ago, there was this explosion. Something happened in our brain such that we started to process information in a fundamentally different way. In a more quicker, more sophisticated, more abstract way, such that we can envision worlds and things that don't exist, and we innovate to make them exist. Okay. This is 100,000 years ago. So this is really fundamental to our intelligence. This is how we develop. We also started to create other things that don't exist. Color. So you saw the ochre piece. We know that some 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens in Southern Africa used very high heat to heat ochre to create color that doesn't exist, red. Okay, this color red doesn't exist in nature, and it turns out that that color had a very special role in society of that time. I think only people of very high status got to use it. And so they went into quite a bit of effort to create it, a color that doesn't exist in nature. So this is, again, part of modern human behavior. And many, many other examples. Okay, of course, the ochre piece as well. All right, so let me get to the brain, and then we can talk about AI. So all of this is possible because we developed a very, very large brain. And when you look at the development of the brain, you begin with 6 million years ago. It's about the time that we became bipedal in the savannas of Africa. And then 3 million years ago, with Australopithecus, the first tool that you saw, the Lomequian tool, showed up, and the brain kept growing and growing. But what's interesting is that it's not a smooth development. Okay? You end up with Neanderthal here. Neanderthals turned out to have bigger brain than we have. Their brain was about 10% larger than us, and specifically because their visual cortex, which is at the back of the brain, was larger, and that's because they lived in dark areas like Northern Europe, which didn't have as much light, and so they had to really develop good visual capacity, and so their visual cortex became much larger than us, and that's why they have a bigger brain. They had a bigger brain than Homo sapiens. But when you look at when you plot the growth of the brain, it's not a smooth upward development, as you can see here. So starting with Australopithecus about 3 or 4 million years ago, you have this gradual development here. And this is when tools first showed up. And this, I think, has to do with Darwin's idea that when we became bipedal, one thing that sort of a side effect was that our hands became free, and our hands became free to do things such as creating tools. Darwin had this idea that by creating tools, by using tools, our brain became bigger. And that's probably this gentle upward development in the size of the brain. But then you get this huge boost in the brain after that, starting with Homo erectus and later. What happened there? People surmise, and this is going to bear directly on my discussion of AI, has to do with fire. Okay, fire started to be used about 800,000 years ago. It was, the fire that occurred naturally through lightning and so forth that our ancestors were able to control and use for things like cooking. So before fire, they only had tools to prepare food with. And so Homo erectus, for example, before fire, spent 8 hours a day, gathering food, cracking it, and chewing and chewing and chewing, 8 hours a day. And they didn't have too much more time left. But even then, they were able to extract only about 30% of nutrients because it was such raw stuff that they're putting in their mouth, 30%. That number becomes very important when we think about AI, 30%. Once fire came in, you were able to pre-digest food outside your body. It became soft. You put it in your mouth, and you didn't have to chew as much, and there was less burden on the digestive system. Yeah. Now, the two organs in our body that use the most calories are our digestive system and our brain. Okay? Our brain, although it's only about 2% of the body weight, consumes 25% of daily caloric intake. So it's a very hungry organ. Once fire came in and we were able to digest, our ancestors were able to pre-digest food so that there was less burden on the digestive system, all that excess energy went to the brain, and that's why you get this huge boost in the growth of the brain. That's the idea. Okay? Now remember, before fire, our ancestors were able to extract at best 30% nutrient. Once fire came in, they were able to extract 100%, almost 100% of what they put in the mouth. And so that also added to the growth of the brain. Okay, so fire changed everything. Once fire became a normal tool to use, Homo erectus and later ancestors were needing to use just 4 hours a day, gathering, preparing, and chewing. They didn't have to chew as much. So from 8 hours before fire to only 4 hours to feed themselves. So that freed up a lot of time, and all that free time went presumably to development of modern human behavior. Okay? So fire really made who we are as Homo sapiens, today's Homo sapiens. Okay. So now I want to, the last part, turn to AI in the context of human evolution. As I said, we're living in a very exciting time, and AI is going to will change so much of what we do, and there'll be lots of wonderful development. But I also want to kind of be cautious about what we are looking at here. Okay? When we think about the effort we put into consuming information today, email, social media, okay? Many of us spend anywhere from 3 to 8 hours or more each day, okay? Consuming information. But when you look at the information that we look at, I would say no more than 30% is worth looking at. You know, when I open my email in the morning, I go through, and no more than 30% of the emails are worth even opening. Yeah? Those numbers match the pre-fire stage of Homo sapiens. Remember, before fire, our ancestors were spending 8 hours a day gathering, preparing, and chewing. But they only got 30% of nutrients. This number indicates to me that we are living in our information age today, pre-fire. Okay, we're not there yet as sophisticated beings when it comes to information. Just like we were very primitive in the way that we fed ourselves before fire. And so one of the things, if evolution is telling us anything, what we need today to fix this 8 hours and 30% is modern day fire, so that we don't have to spend as much time consuming information, and that whatever information we consume, we can get, 90% or 100% nutrient instead of only 30%. Okay? What that fire is, your guess is as good as mine. I'm sure you have some ideas on that. Okay. One thing that is important to keep in mind about AI and the development of human intelligence is something that Darwin said. What he said is that of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is by far the most important. Darwin recognized that what made us human, as opposed to monkeys, is not our ability to speak, not our ability to make visual art, but our sense of morality and ethics, which differentiated us from the lower primates. That's interesting. I was actually kind of surprised when I ran across this quote. If you look at AI, if you look at ChatGPT or GPT-4, they have billions, hundreds of billions of parameters built in, but not a single parameter can tell you what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral. Not a single parameter. Okay? That's not built into AI. Okay? So AI is not human by Darwin's standard. But if you're going to unleash this extremely powerful technology onto our society, we really do need to keep this Darwin's point in mind. We need somehow to be able to instill this technology with humanness of this moral conscience. How we do that, I don't know, but I think it's critical that we really think about this as society. Going back to the brain, you saw that over the past 3 million years, the brain has grown by about 3 times from Australopithecus 3 million years ago to today. But here's something interesting that's been found recently. That brain, which has been growing for 3 million years, has, in fact, reduced in size over the last 20,000 years by about 13%, which is the size of a tennis ball. Okay, by 13%. So our brain is shrinking after growing for 3 million years. Why is that? Are we getting dumber? I don't think so. What people who've thought about this believe is that, starting 100,000 years ago, we began to process information fundamentally in a different way. We became much more symbolic. And importantly, and this is important for AI, we no longer needed to process every piece of raw data that was coming in. Okay? We cherry pick the information that comes in, and we build a symbolic representation of the world through which we interact with the world. And because we don't need to process every piece of raw data that comes in, but instead we select the pieces that we need to create a world, we became much more symbolic. And because the brain membrane is a very expensive membrane, as you saw, it consumes 25% of caloric intake, although it's only 2% of the body weight. If the brain doesn't need the membranes for all that processing, it just gets rid of it. And now we are 13% less in brain volume. But in many ways, we've gotten smarter because we're able to cherry pick the data that we really need to create the kind of world, the representation that we need. If you look at large language models of today, it's exactly the opposite of how we have developed as human beings. Okay? Large language models are designed to take in every piece of data that comes in and somehow deal with it. You have to keep feeding it data. Right now, the real competition among Google and OpenAI and so forth is to find more data to feed the large language models. Okay? But this is exactly the opposite of how we developed as Homo sapiens. Okay? And so this is something to think about. So it's recognized by AI specialists that generative AI is as good as the quality of the data we feed it. And it's also recognized that highest quality data are found in published books and articles carefully edited by professionals. Okay? But here's something to worry about. We will run out of this high quality data by 2026, according to some specialists. Okay? And now we are in a race, a desperate hunt for digital data, as New York Times mentioned just a few weeks ago. Okay? We see examples of this. Again, it's from New York Times. Whisper, which is an application that was created by OpenAI to transcribe YouTube audio against the policy of YouTube. They're so fixed on getting more data that they created this Whisper, which goes into YouTube and scrapes audio from it and transcribes it and make it into data. That's against the policy of YouTube, because YouTube, by policy, you're not supposed to use automated systems to scrape things off YouTube. Why hasn't YouTube made more issue out of this? According to New York Times, it's because, according to them, that the owner of YouTube, Google, also does this. Everyone is really, really competing to get more data. A large tech company discussed buying Simon & Schuster, a big publishing house, just so that they can get this high quality data. There is talk of creating synthetic data, because we're going to run out of natural data. Creating synthetic data to feed our large language models. Okay? And so all of this is worrisome. Okay? And it's exactly the opposite of the way that we developed as human beings. You think about synthetic data, what that sort of hints at is the kind of stuff that's going on now with deep fake junk that's going on. In a recent interview, Eric Schmidt, a former chief executive of Google, talks about deep fake like video as problem is going to get much worse over the next few years. And if people are going to start creating synthetic data, that will only add to this problem. So this is not to say that AI is bad. I think AI in the right hands and in the right way to think about it is going to be the next big thing. It already is. Okay. We're seeing ideas for, instead of large language models, smaller language models, which are focused on a particular field, discipline, where you get high quality data from a special, like pharmaceutical or other very specialized areas. Those models behave much more like how we developed as human beings. The real issue is what to do about general artificial intelligence, the ambition that companies have of replicating human intelligence and maybe going beyond human intelligence, what's called singularity. That one is worrisome, given all that we've seen. There's a lot of junk that's going into large language models, and it's going to be more and more. Okay? So someone is going to need to invent fire for the information age so that we are no longer having to cope with so much garbage that we live in today. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing so we can look at each other.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And Suzanne already has a question, so I don't need to give one. Suzanne, jump in.
Well, I wanted to go back to how human intelligence is this leap. It's not an evolutionary process the way other evolutionary things go in increments. And this leap where we have symbolic language and all the things that, that humans do that no other animal does. And then what I put in the chat was, how come cave paintings happened all over the world at the same time? All of a sudden we had art that we didn't travel. So how come it happened all over the world? And somewhat same thing for pyramids all over the world at about the same time, stone circles all over the world. What's going on? Is there something in the universe where there's everything is ready to come when it's time? And then how does that work? Maybe these are the questions you can never answer, but they're the ones I think about.
Suzanne, thank you for the question. Cave art, that's what you said, right?
Well, that too, all of a sudden, between 300, 400,000 years ago, all over the world, never before.
Yeah. So if you look at cave art, which I've looked at just a little bit, there's something really interesting about cave art, and I agree with you. It's a mystery. Why did it happen? Why did it happen all over the world? Africa, we're finding some of the oldest cave art, narrative cave art in Indonesia, for example. There's something very interesting about cave art that's not well known. And that is that cave art, although it's visual, it's apparently, at least in part, acoustically based. Acoustically based. This is how I got interested in it. There are three mysteries about cave art that archaeologists have talked about. One, the cave artists went very deep into the caves to draw cave art. Okay? If you try to go down there today with a headlamp and ladder, it's still very precarious. Why did they go down so deep into caves to draw cave art? That's one mystery. Okay? The second mystery, when you look at the wall where the cave art is drawn, you notice that the cave art is focused just in this one spot, and the rest of this huge wall is completely ignored. Why is that? And third, cave art tends to represent animals with hooves, like cow and deer and so forth. Well, many, many years ago, some archaeologists who have really puzzled over this went into a cave, I think it was in Spain, one of the famous cave arts, and just, on a lark, clapped their hand, and then everything came together. What they found was the deeper they go in, the more echoing effect that you get. And so the cave artists were going for the echo effect, one. And two, they realized that the echo was coming right off the spot where the cave art was. And they were making sounds deep down there, striking stalagmites and stalactites that made hoofed sounds. Mm-hmm. And so, at least in part, it doesn't explain everything. There are lots of cave art that doesn't, but at least a part of it is acoustically based. And you could sort of imagine what was going on, that, echo is a very mysterious effect for people of that time. You're making sound over here, but the sound is coming from over there where there is no apparent sound source. Okay. And so the hypothesis is that they imagined that behind that cave wall where the echoing was coming off of, there's another world where the sound is coming from, and they are marking the entrance to the world. Okay, so you have acoustics, you have visual, and now you have religion, all bundled up together. It's a fascinating topic. I'm glad you mentioned it.
Linda.
Oh, okay. So I have a couple of things that cross my mind here. This is fascinating. I'm just eating it all up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I just can't believe that we can't stop this. Why are they going to? Why do we just have to keep going with more and more food? I mean, anyway, that's one question, and then the other question is that we are living in vulnerability with these large models or anything because of our use of electricity. And so if we have a disruption with, there are many different ways that we could get massive disruptions in electricity, what effect is that going to have on something that we will have become so dependent on? And I think of it as being disastrous. So my curiosity is on several levels here.
Thank you. I'll just the first one right away. The race is on for more data. It's very clear. Your Googles, your open AIs of the world, they are going after data. They may be buying up the biggest publishing houses to circumvent copyright. But as that slide showed, we're going to run out of high quality data in 2026. So what's going to happen then? Maybe
what is
we'll
going to
come up with
happen
something.
then?
I don't know. It can be good. Let me put it that, unless someone come up with some solution for it. And humans are pretty creative, so maybe we'll come up. But the other solution is to invent fire so that we don't have to have so much data, and AIs become smarter. What the fire is, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But we are in a race right now for data, to feed large language models more and more data. Exactly the opposite of what happened to humans.
Yes, I got that. And I'm like, oh my God, my stomach has got a turn in it.
But let me also say that, in these very well-defined areas like medicine, pharmaceuticals, and others, we're going to see huge advances that are going to improve the quality of our life. So I'm not putting down AI. It's just that there are some aspects that we need to
Yeah, I get that.
really be cognizant of, cautious of.
And so what about the loss of power?
Well, that's not just AI, but just in general. As more countries become developed, they're going to need more energy. Where is that going to come from? As China, as India, as Africa moves up in the food chain, they're going to require more and more energy. Where is that going to come from?
Is that the new fire, whatever that is?
No, that's exactly the opposite. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Very nice questions.
Thank you, Linda. Shigeru, it really troubles me that we're becoming increasingly symbolic, as you pointed out. I completely agree with you, and I'm fascinated to see the evidence of the brain shrinking. I want to test my assumption that comes at the cost of not noticing the present moment as well. Neanderthals, as I understand it, were much better able to actually sense their environment. And I want to just point, and again, it's in the similar line of doom that we seem to be pursuing. It bothers me a great deal that we disappear more and more into a world of abstraction and disconnection from the actual environment and from one another. The possibility of increasing disinformation and coming into, just talking directly to AIs rather than to other people, going into our own little bubbles, even having separate models that have their own information bases that are quite disconnected from one another. So, and people just accessing their particular brand of AI. I just want to go back to that piece though. Am I right in thinking that it comes at this cost of disconnection from what's actually going on? Is that borne out by the archaeological record?
Well, yes, absolutely. The United Nations has named loneliness as a pandemic in modern society because we're so isolated now. Loneliness is a pandemic that needs to be, because we are becoming more isolated because of all of this technology and since Industrial Revolution, this multi-generational family has broken down into nuclear or even smaller units now. So it's not just abstraction, but our society is really suffering. And you see it. You see it in issues of mental illness and dissociation. I think it's a very serious problem that hasn't quite surfaced as clearly, but definitely is there. I mean, do animals have mental issues? I don't know. I don't study animals, but they're processing raw data, and so they're very much on the ground and in touch with nature, unlike us.
Is there evidence that Neanderthals with their bigger brains were better, more sensorily oriented? Is that an accurate view?
The largeness has to do with their visual cortex, because they were living in a dark area of the world, Northern Europe, And so they needed to develop a better vision so they can see. It's not that they were any smarter or somehow more engaged with the world. They just needed a better vision to see in the dark.
Thank you. Hank?
Yeah, just what you were saying. I was thinking of the term, the ancient term is alienation. But as a psychotherapist, there's been a lot of talk about, more literature about self-alienation between people, and then the cultural influences on people being alienated from each other or disconnected or from oneself. And I'm wondering, the pace of change for our brains is not 2026. It's going to take too long, but trying to imagine in the future what our brains might be like in, I don't know, a couple of 100 years, where there's alienation, where there's the living in this ethereal world where connection is no longer built into our neural apparatus. So I'm wondering, sir, if you could, I don't know, at least for us to address it a little bit.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's going to be by 2026.
No, it's going to take a little bit longer than that. By let's say iPhone 200, our brain is going to be the size of the iPhone, I think, given how quickly our brain is shedding membrane. We are going to be a very different being 200 years from now or 500 years from now, and it's hard to say where we're going to go. I mean, there are certain things we know. This doesn't directly address. There are people who study faces over the development of evolution, and they can project how we're going to look. Let's say 1,000 years from now. What's really clear, and this has to do with fire that started this. We eat softer and softer food, which means our jaws are getting thinner and thinner. And so by 500,000 years from now, our faces are going to be really thin because we don't need all this muscle. And that's going to, also parallel our brain size, which, because we're counting more and more on these things to store our memory, we don't need as much brain membrane.
There's a new book out by I think it's a psychologist or a philosopher, Jonathan Haidt, Haight. I don't know if familiar, but I mean it's getting popularly sold, but it's something about an increase in anxiety and depression and problems in neural regulation for the younger generation. And I'm wondering if this is another factor, because some kids have been grown up with these iPhones since they're 6 months old, or so I don't know if it's happening sooner for multiple reasons, but something about this, call it addiction to the phone.
Well, we're doing this huge experiment on our population, especially on our youth, and we have no idea what the results are. The social media, it just suddenly in the last 20 years, it took over our lives. So we're spending so much of our time, like pre-fire Homo erectus, on it, and yet we're getting very little nutrients from it. We really don't know what kind of effect it's going to have on our generation or younger generation.
So Shigeru, this would mean a spurt of the brain getting smaller, the beginnings of this epoch, maybe.
I think that part is very clear, that that's going to continue.
Okay. Wow.
Woo. But not necessarily that we're going to get dumber, although that's possible. It's just that our brain doesn't need as much membrane as before fire.
Mark raised a very interesting point earlier. He was questioning you made the statement that we really don't know why language evolved, Shigeru. I wonder if we could return to that just for a moment, because it's a very surprising idea. As he points out, it seems to be highly functional in terms of enabling many capabilities. Could you perhaps elaborate on that a little bit further?
Yeah, so there are sort of a couple points to it. There's the initial point. Whenever this language appeared, we didn't need it, right? We were communicating fine with each other before language. It's not like suddenly someone decided, okay, we got to be able to communicate more. We got to be able to communicate more sophisticated. You know, that didn't happen. And so whatever it was, this descent with modification that ultimately ended up as language, it was something completely different. And we have no idea what that is. But the after effect of that is that we now have this language that we use for communication. And it's just completely, I think, arbitrary development in modern human behavior that gave us language. The debate that's going on now, it's a real debate among language specialists, is what is language designed for today? So one group says language is designed for communication. Right? That's sort of the obvious. That's what we use. But then a second group, people like my colleague Noam Chomsky, say, no, language is designed to represent human thought. And the fact that we use it for communication is secondary. And he knows things like, you know, when you think about how we use language from the time we wake up until the time we go to sleep, much of it is just in our brain. We're not communicating with anybody, right? But we are having these thoughts. So that's, you know, we're sort of kind of duking it out, communication or human thought. It may not be such a critical thing for people who are not involved with debate, but if you're in this debate, boy, you go to a conference and you will get someone's peace of mind if you say the wrong thing. Oh.
I'd like to read out a question from Roy Rada, who's requested it, and we'll probably make this the last question, I think. You implied that humans use symbolism to filter through vast amounts of information. However, neuroscience evidence suggests that human sensory input is filtered at the periphery by inhibitory pathways that are continually operating at a subconscious level. Might we argue that consciousness and language are based on pattern recognition activities for which symbolism is our convenient way of talking about it, but not reflective of what happens biologically?
That's a very hard question. I guess it has to do with definition of symbolism. I guess and you know, I can go with that, but you know, things like the reduction in the size of the brain, you know, over the last 20,000 years, that's a fact. 13%. Why did that happen? I think the likely candidate is that we didn't need as much of the membrane because we don't have to process as much raw data as before. And a reasonable assumption there is that we use less data to represent the world in a symbolic way or abstract way. Okay? But if you can come up with another story for why the brain, after tripling in size over 3 million years, it decided to start to reduce in size, I'm very much open to that suggestion.
Well, Roy responds, an alternate hypothesis is that we passed our cognitive activities to organizations. Do you mean literal organizations, Roy? Is that what you mean? It's while he's responding, because yes, he does. I think, would you like a little more clarification on that one?
I missed we are organizing ourselves differently. I'm sorry.
We passed our cognitive activities to clans, tribes, states, groups, that we're
I see.
relying more upon groups
I see.
than previously.
I see.
Um,
That's interesting. That's interesting.
culture, I guess.
We outsource things.
Yeah. I think it's also possible that the brain could have shrunk simply through finding better ways to pre-process, biologically. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but it seems like there's a number of hypotheses that could be entertained. For example, filtering out parts of visual spectra that we don't need as often, but subtle forms of that. So
all of these are interesting ideas, and they're perfectly valid hypotheses to entertain. The only thing I would say is that large language models don't work anywhere, any way like what we're talking about. It's just this massive, undivided, digestive system that takes in whatever you throw in and throws out whatever it does in a very mysterious black box way.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. This has been such a provocative and interesting talk. I think many of us are leading with a lot of new ideas and questions. I really appreciate your time, Professor Miyagawa, and hope that you come and speak with us again at some time. Thank you so much. And thanks, audience, for your wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. It was so nice speaking with all of you.
Can we save the chat?
Yes, I can save the chat before I leave. Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Are you going to send me the chat? I
don't. Yes, if you don't, you can email me if you like, paul.atkins@prosocial.world. But I'm also happy to see if we can make it available somehow on the site along with the recording of this.
Okay, thank you. Because I thought I could save the chat, but I don't see the right button.
Right, I'll just turn the recording off and then we'll see if we can work that one out.